Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarita Bashalieva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post questions for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Professor Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anara. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to our program our great friend, Dr. Alexander Motyl from Rutgers University, New Jersey, here in the USA. I hope this program will be watched across the globe by many of our friends, as Dr. Alexander Motyl is not only a professor of political science at Rutgers-Newark, but a great specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, on nationalism, revolutions, empires, and he is the author of many books on nonfiction, including one he wrote 30 years ago titled Dilemmas of Independence, Ukraine After Totalitarianism, and many others. He was on our program twice with his, as it turns now, annual update, and we are very glad to hear what he is going to say. His almost daily activity is amazing, and I constantly repost his bylines in The Hill and many other editions. His latest was titled aptly, Ukraine Cannot Negotiate with a Nation That Wants to Erase Its People from Existence. Welcome, Dr. Motyl.
Thank you so much, Professor Fett. Thank you, colleagues. And thank you in general to the public for having the patience to listen. And I trust and hope that my comments will be of interest to you. I'll try to keep them within 30 minutes so as to enable us to have a more interesting and a longer Q&A, during which I would welcome whatever comments you have, whatever questions you have, however positive, however negative they might be. And I'm hoping that we could have an interesting discussion. In any case, as has been said, this is my third appearance on this particular podcast. It's always been an honor, it's always been a pleasure, and it remains an honor and a pleasure as well. 2 years ago when I gave my first talk, there were lots of new things to talk about. One could talk about, the Russian invasion had taken place, the Ukrainians were fighting back, the invasion looked like it had stalled, and there was a great deal of interest on the part of the world media, as well as on the public within the United States. That was also the case last year, inasmuch as last year witnessed the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which, as you know, didn't quite work out. But there was hope, there was expectation, there was a sense that something was about to happen. This time, as you know, the attention of the media for Ukraine and for the war in general, and here I mean both the European, but especially the American media, is significantly lower, partly due to the fact that the war is now in its third year, and as you know, American attention spans tend to be significantly shorter than 3 years. Indeed, it's almost a miracle that the American public was interested in Ukraine and its president, Mr. Zelensky, for about 2 years. And then, of course, other crises, other wars have come to dominate the headlines, especially the fighting in Gaza, more generally in Palestine and Israel. So Ukraine has kind of drifted off into the background, but it's also drifted into the background because, at least within the last, say, half year or so, nothing exceptionally dramatic has taken place. The fighting on the front is obviously still taking place pretty much along the entire front line, from Kherson in the south to the Donbass in the east, and now in Kharkiv in the north. And yes, the Russians have managed to capture something like 200 square miles in the last few months, which sounds like a lot, but when you look at what they've actually achieved on the map, it's really very little. It's incremental growth, it's incremental progress for them. And at the same time, as you may be aware, as you're probably aware, Russian losses, casualties have been extraordinarily high. They've been losing on average somewhere between 1,200 and 1,400 soldiers, that is to say, dead and wounded, every day for the last one, possibly even 2 months. These are staggering losses. In a democratic society, they would be intolerable. In a dictatorship, of course, which is able to manipulate information, they can be ignored or at least made to seem more tolerable. But in any case, the Ukrainians have lost a bit of territory. The Russians have gained a bit as a result. But at the end of the day, they've paid an extremely high price in terms of human lives. They've lost hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and so on. We don't quite know what the Ukrainian losses are like. President Zelensky said recently, about a week or so ago, that the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian losses is 8-1. If so, that would mean that Ukrainians are losing about 150 to 200 soldiers a day in comparison to the 13, 14, or 1,500 that the Russians are losing. That's still quite a lot for Ukraine's significantly smaller population, but is also indicative, perhaps, assuming that the data are correct, but is also indicative of the ability of the Ukrainians to impose severe damage on the Russian armed forces. Notice, by the way, that these losses have been imposed on the Russians by a Ukrainian army that is suffering still from enormous shortages of artillery, ammunition, planes, drones, and things of that sort, thanks in large measure to the fact that the United States dilly-dallied, that's really the only word that is appropriate here, about providing continued assistance to Ukraine for roughly 6 months. It was only about a month and a half or so ago that the House of Representatives finally approved a measure that released $60+ billion worth of assistance to Ukraine. Had that assistance been forthcoming, say 6 months ago, 7 months ago, then the advances that the Russians made in terms of territory would probably not have taken place, or certainly not have taken place to such an extent. And it's conceivable that their losses could have been even higher. Anyway, if we look at that, so I mean, if we simply look at the balance, Russian lives versus Ukrainian territory, the Russians are paying an extraordinarily high price for incremental gains, but the gains are taking place. And if one projects these dynamics into the future and imagines that the Russians are willing to sacrifice millions of their own soldiers for continued incremental gains, and dictators such as Putin are generally wont to do this, then it's not inconceivable that Russia will continue to proceed in its territorial advances while paying an extraordinarily high price. That is unlikely to happen for reasons that I'll talk about in a second, but the primary one being that the weaponry, the ammunition that was promised Ukraine is beginning to flow. And it seems like that it's very likely, highly likely, possibly even inevitable that within a few weeks, Ukraine will be sufficiently armed not only to stop these advances, but perhaps even to push them back. Anyway, when we look at the balance, sort of the good news versus the bad news, we come up with a sort of a balanced assessment. I mean, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that something in the nature of a stalemate seems to be in play. So in terms of the good news for Ukraine, and when I speak of good news, I mean, I'm unabashedly pro-Ukrainian in this particular case. The Ukrainians have essentially defeated the Russian Navy and forced it out of most of the Black Sea. This is remarkable for a country that has no navy. Grain exports have risen to the level that they were at before the war. And that's again in large measure due to the fact that Ukraine has driven the Russian Navy from the Black Sea. Ukraine has advanced drone capacities. As I mentioned before, Russian casualties seem to be significantly higher. Ukraine has also been degrading Russia's energy sector, the oil and gas terminals, refineries, and things of that sort. And it's been estimated that Russia's capacity, energy producing capacity, has been reduced by something like 15 to 20%. This is very high. And this is having both immediate and medium and longer term effects on the Russian economy, and could in fact even get to the point of affecting the military. So there are a bunch of things that have happened over the last few months that are generally positive for Ukraine. At the same time, there are negative instances. We already talked about the territorial advances that the Russians have made. Ukraine is currently suffering from a shortage of soldiers. Despite the fact that a very large number of Ukrainians are patriotically motivated, many of them joined the armed forces 2 years ago. Many continued to join the armed forces over the last 2 years. It is also a fact that there are people who are avoiding the draft. Others are trying to escape, and there is an acknowledged shortage of soldiers. So just recently, Ukraine has actually turned to prisoners serving sentences for minor crimes, nothing serious, and something like 4,100, I believe, have offered to serve. That's both good and bad news. On the one hand, there are prisoners willing to go to the front. On the other hand, it also shows that the Ukrainians are in some acute need of additional armed soldiers. The Russians continue to have superiority in the air. That's very much bad news for Ukraine, especially as they're using not just a variety of missiles, but they also have something called glide bombs, which are released on their side of the front line and then kind of fly into the Ukrainian positions and have been very, very destructive. And as you know, Russia has been systematically bombing the energy producing stations, the electricity producing stations in Ukraine. It's been estimated that something like 60 to 70% of Ukraine's electricity capacity has been destroyed. Apparently, it's complicated and difficult, and to rebuild these facilities, certainly in the short term. So it's likely that the Ukrainian population will be facing a very cold winter, unless, of course, something dramatically changes on the front lines. Anyway, you look at both of these ledgers, the positive and the negative, and it's hard not to come to the conclusion that there's a rough parity. The Ukrainians are killing more Russians, but the Russians are destroying more of Ukraine. The term that's been used to describe the war at this point is a war of attrition, where both sides are more or less equally balanced and are essentially trying to deplete the resources of the other side. In the Russian case, they're depleting the infrastructure, cities, of course, and other kinds of material, physical infrastructure. The Ukrainians, in contrast, are depleting the human resources of the Russians. And then the question is, which side can survive in the longer term, which side will prevail in the longer term. And again, you should know that, lots of people are making predictions. Yes, the war will take place, will continue for another year. Some people say for 5 years, some people say for a few months. Bottom line is, no one, including myself, really knows. I mean, these are all suppositions based on certain assumptions. We don't really know. That's not going to stop me from making certain kinds of predictions a bit later. But please be aware of the fact that this is all educated guesswork, sometimes even uneducated guesswork. And essentially the question is, how much damage, how much suffering can Ukraine sustain? Given the fact that most of the population remains committed to recapturing the occupied territories, the most of the population is committed to a sovereign, democratic, independent Ukraine. Nevertheless, the question is valid. How much pain are they willing to endure? Won't their ability to endure that pain decline over time? And at the same time, how much pain are the Russians willing to endure? Even though Putin obviously has no particular interest in the Russian population, he's willing to sacrifice millions of Russians. The bottom line is, sooner or later, the majority of the Russian population will know, if it already doesn't know, that it's losing men and women in a horrific manner. As a matter of fact, by the way, according to Ukrainian estimates, close to 500,000 Russian soldiers have been killed and or severely wounded in the last 2.5 years. Ukrainian estimates were always considered to be excessively optimistic. That is to say, they were considered to exaggerate the number of wounded and dead. But just in 2-3 or so weeks ago, both the French and the British released their estimates, and they were virtually identical to those of the Ukrainians, which means, I think, that we can trust the Ukrainian estimates as being pretty much accurate, obviously with a certain degree of a margin of error. But the bottom line is that probably something like 500,000 Russians have been put out of commission is a result of the war. It's usually, the ratio of wounded to dead is usually 3-1. If that's the case, that would mean that roughly 125, 130,000 Russians have been killed, and about 300 plus have been wounded, 350, 360, thereabouts. In the Russian case, the actual ratio might be more like 2-1. There is a lot of evidence suggesting that the Russians are neglecting their wounded, they're letting them die on the battlefield. And if that's the case, then the number of deaths to the number of wounded might be significantly higher. That would mean that it's more like 175,000 dead plus 225, 250 or so thousand wounded. In any case, whatever the exact numbers, the numbers, as you can see, are staggering and they're horrific. And sooner or later is the expectation they will begin to affect perceptions within Russia. Anyway, given that situation, what can tip the balance in one way or the other? And this is where the analysis gets a little more interesting, because thus so far we've essentially been saying, I've essentially been saying that it's pretty much even. And where do we go from here? Well, things depend on two particular factors. I mean, one is Russia and Putin, and the other is the West. And my argument essentially boils down to the fact that the outcome of the war will depend on those two factors far more so than anything else. And you know the argument for the West. Let me start with that. And I think, again, I've made the case, and hundreds of others have made the case more eloquently and more persuasively than me, that if the West, and by that I mean NATO, the United States, the countries of Europe and North America, if they want Ukraine to win, and are willing to supply Ukraine with the necessary weapons, the necessary ammunition, both planes, tanks, artillery shells, and so on, the West will win. It's really that simple. Ukraine has the capacity to fight. It's better at fighting than the Russians are. And the thing that has been holding back the Ukrainians is the dearth of ammunition and weapons. They've been able to hold the Russians pretty much to a stalemate, even though, as I said before, they were deprived of the necessary assistance over the last 6-7 months. One can well imagine what the difference would have been like, what the Ukrainians would have been capable of doing had they had that necessary assistance. And that means, amongst other things, the continued delivery of HIMARS missiles, ATACMS, ATACMS missiles are now being delivered. They have a further reach and are much more accurate than the HIMARS. Just yesterday, apparently the United States has agreed, it was announced that the White House gave its approval to Ukraine's using American weapons in Russia, but only in the area near Kharkiv Oblast, near Kharkiv province, where the Russians have been able to attack fairly successfully, at least for a couple of weeks, primarily because the Ukrainians were in no position to respond. Now they apparently do have that capacity, and they have the permission not only of the United States, but of 11 more European countries, which have all agreed that their weapons may be used by Ukraine against Russia. If that's the case, and if that truly continues, and if deliveries accelerate, and if they remain at the sufficiently high level, in other words, if the West, and we're talking about the United States in particular, decides that it wants Ukraine to win, Ukraine will win. And regardless of how one defines victory, whether that means pushing Russia back to the position it occupied in February of 2022, whether it means pushing the Russians out of the Crimea and the remaining territories, or at least partially thereof, whatever one defines victory as being, the West and Ukraine can achieve it, but on condition that the West wants to achieve it. The major obstacle at this point has been twofold. Countries like the United States, well, most Western countries have been afraid of two things. One is that the Russians might respond to intensified deliveries of ammunition and weapons by escalating. And then the fear is that sooner or later the West, NATO countries might get involved in some kind of military altercation with Russia directly. And of course, the Russians might escalate in any number of ways. That would be the second source of concern. The one that is of greatest fear, that produces the greatest fear within Western countries, is that Russia might be tempted to use tactical nuclear weapons, conceivably in Ukraine, possibly, and this is the really scary part for Western countries, in places like the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, possibly even Poland. None of that is to be excluded. That, of course, would be opening a Pandora's box. It would be an irrational, deadly, and ultimately self-defeating move, but it could also have all sorts of dreadful consequences for the world in general, not just for Ukraine and Ukrainians, but for East Europeans, West Europeans, and other countries in the world. So those two factors have restrained people from providing too much assistance. There's been another one, namely a third, and that is that if Ukraine wins too much, or to put it differently, if Russia loses too much, there's the possibility that the regime might collapse. And if the regime collapses, there's a possibility that Russia might collapse. Many people consider that to be a good thing. I happen to agree. But we could talk about that later if you're interested. But the fear in the State Department, the Pentagon, and in a variety of foreign ministries throughout Europe is that under such circumstances, it's conceivable that the nuclear weapons in Russia, the so-called nukes, would become loose. That was a similar concern in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if the loose nukes become very loose, they could fall into the hands of rogue generals, terrorists, and God knows who else. That's unlikely in my opinion, but obviously that possibility cannot simply be excluded completely. And that's the fear that many Western capitals have. They seem to be overcoming those fears, but at this point in time, they are still very much in place and are one of the key factors in restraining excessive, or not so much excessive, but adequate deliveries of Western assistance to Ukraine. That's factor number one. And a sub-factor of that is, of course, the issue of Donald Trump. Some people argue that Trump would never have permitted Russia to have invaded. And they usually then argue that if he's reelected, he would see to it that Russia pays a very high price. Others, of course, point to the fact that he's never been fully supportive of Ukraine. He's been palsy with Putin. So it's unclear as to what his attitude would be toward Ukraine and Russia. Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, when he was here on a trip, met with Trump. This was about 2 months ago, met with Trump and then reported that Trump wouldn't be willing to spend even a penny on Ukraine. That same Trump, several days ago, apparently declared at a fundraiser that he would have bombed Moscow after Russia invaded, and he would bomb Beijing if China invades Taiwan. So we're getting a whole bunch of very mixed messages from Trump, which go simply to reinforce the fact that he's unpredictable. He's serendipitous. He could turn out to be the greatest thing in the world for Ukraine. He could turn out to be the worst thing in the world for Ukraine. We simply do not know what his possible response would be. We do know what Biden's would be. Thus far, he's been criticized for delivering too little, too late. That's a valid criticism. The positive side of Biden, is that he has delivered, albeit too little, and too late. But in the longer scheme of things, it's certainly been sufficient to enable Ukraine to survive. So you can decide for yourself which of these alternatives is better for Ukraine. In any case, it's somewhat of a toss-up, although my own personal leanings, I would prefer, I think, that the Biden alternative, simply because there is a guarantee of continued assistance. And with Trump, the fear is that it might be a double or nothing kind of situation, at least with regard to Ukraine. With respect to their other policies, I leave that up to your own judgment. And then finally, there's Russia. And here, as you know, there is disagreement within the expert community. Some people consider Russia to be stable, Putin to be fully in charge. The economy is growing. Overall, lots of good news for the Russians. I mean, they're massively expanding their production of ammunition, weaponry. In other words, good news for the Russians and all sorts of reasons to believe that their ability to sustain the war will only get stronger over time. I happen to disagree with this view, and I belong in the other camp, which argues that Russia is actually unstable, the economy is weak, the sanctions have succeeded, Putin is weak, and the chances of some kind of massive instability within the elite and possibly even within the country are growing with every day. As you can see, these two positions are diametrically opposed. I'll just emphasize two of them just to give you a sense, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of arguments that are made. One is with respect to the Russian GDP. It grew something like 3.5% over the last year, and many news outlets and experts point to that as saying, see, sanctions have failed, the Russian economy is booming, all's well. Critics of that view, and they're primarily Russian economists, Russian opposition economists, so that's where essentially I draw my personal inspiration, argue that, well, yes, that's true. If one looks more closely at the distribution of growth, one finds that it's overwhelmingly concentrated in the military sector, which is now responsible for something like 25 or 30% of the Russian GDP, if I'm not mistaken. So it's enormous. So Putin has been pumping tons of money into the military sector in order to produce the weapons and ammunition he needs. So that's been growing at 10, 15, 20, or thereabout percent clips. If one then looks at the consumer goods sectors, those are either stagnant or in decline. That is to say, they're experiencing negative growth. So if you disaggregate the figures, the picture becomes significantly more complicated. The military sectors are growing rapidly, and that's good, except of course that it's only about 600, 700,000 Russians who are employed in these sectors. Well, excuse me, it's somewhat more. 600 to 700,000 are in the energy sectors. But nevertheless, that suggests that the growth is confined to a particular part of the economy, and those sectors that affect the vast majority of the economy, namely the consumer sectors, are experiencing either stagnation or negative growth. And so hence, people, the Russian opposition economists and people like me, we argue that on the one hand, the number of Russians who are dying has now reached 500,000, and at current rates, it'll probably be more like 750, possibly 800,000 by the end of the year. And on the other hand, Russians are clearly suffering from a declining economy, inflation on a variety of goods, growing unemployment, well, some degree of unemployment, and so on. So depending on how you view that particular factor, namely the economy, you can come up with completely different opinions. And the same holds true for Mr. Putin. And so, for instance, people argue that he's now firmly in control, and they point to the fact that a variety of generals have been arrested. He's shuffled the cabinet. He won the elections. The FSB is more than happy to exercise violence in its pursuit of ends. He got away with killing Alexei Navalny, and so on and so forth. And the critics of that view, myself included, argue, well, that's all very true, but the fact that he, in the run-up to the elections, well, first of all, the elections were rigged, so he didn't really win much of anything. Secondly, in the run-up to the elections, one of the candidates who was opposed to him, albeit in a kind of moderate fashion, Boris Nadezhdin, actually managed to get 200,000 people to sign off on his candidacy. That suggests that there's more to Russian discontent that meets the eye. Yes, Alexei Navalny was killed, but we also know from eyewitness accounts that somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Russians came to his funeral, which again suggests that something is going on. Yes, Putin has fired and arrested for corruption and malfeasance a variety of generals and other military officials, but that seems to suggest not just so much that he's in control, but that there's actually potential opposition to him, and it may be centered in the military. Anyway, as you can see, the argument, I mean, there is evidence on both sides of the ledger. My own view, as I said, tends to see Putin as being significantly weaker than he claims to be, and this Russian system, the Russian economy, is being significantly weaker than many Westerners believe it is. And that obviously matters for a projection of the war. If Putin is weak, if the system is weak, if the economy is weak, that means that Russia is likely to get progressively weaker as the months go by. And hence the conclusion that one would draw is that Russia, the long-term prospects for Russia are actually bleak rather than being strong. Alternatively, if you think Putin is in charge, then, and the economy is doing well, then one would conclude that the prospects for Russia in the long term are actually quite good. As I've already said, I disagree with that analysis. I don't think it holds up to closer scrutiny, but it is the analysis that is favored by many people, and it's certainly something that is worth keeping in mind. I think I'll leave it at that. Let me just conclude with one final comment. And again, none of this is going to surprise you. Russians, Ukrainians, but also Western analysts and policymakers generally agree, they actually agree on something, that the next 6 or so months will be decisive. Now, what that means is unclear, but the expectation is that something is likely to happen, something arguably big. In other words, the Russians may succeed in taking advantage of this window of opportunity that's been opened to them by the non-delivery of Western weaponry. That's likely to continue for a few more weeks. If they've already started taking advantage of this in the East, North, and South, if they continue with this and if they redouble their efforts, it is not inconceivable that they'll be able to make certain significant progress. Unlikely, I think, but not inconceivable. Alternatively, if the Russians can be kept at bay, and if the Ukrainians get significant support and are able to push the Russians back, that would have potentially significant consequences for the war and for the willingness of both sides to come up with some kind of negotiated solution. At this point in time, as you know, the Ukrainians in the West are saying, well, most policymakers in the Ukrainians are essentially saying that negotiations are a non-starter. And they say this for a very simple reason, because effectively what the Russians are proposing is that they will keep everything they've occupied, plus territory that they claim is theirs. They want to transform Ukraine into a vassal state. They want to destroy Ukrainian culture, identity, and language. There's just no way that any country could possibly agree to those sorts of terms. Essentially, the Russians are proposing that Ukrainians commit collective suicide, and no one is going to agree to that. But if some Ukrainians manage to turn the tables on the Russians, which is not inconceivable, then the prospects for some kind of negotiation become better. Ultimately, however, and this will be my final comment, and I see I've already taken more time than I had wanted to, everything ultimately depends on Putin. As long as Putin is in power, in whichever condition he happens to be in, it will be very unlikely that he will be willing to negotiate anything resembling a compromise solution, whatever you mean by compromise. But it's just, he's invested so much of his own personality, his character, his own personal capital into the war, into a victorious outcome for the war, that for me personally, it's just impossible to imagine how he could possibly agree to anything short of what he's currently demanding. It would be a defeat for him personally. It would be a defeat for him politically. I just don't see that happening, which ultimately means that the war is likely to continue for as long as Putin is around. If you're an optimist, that is likely, if you believe in that Russia is stable, you are likely to think that that will be for a long time. If you believe that Russia, the regime, and Putin are weak, brittle, and unstable, then you may draw the conclusion that his demise, whether physical or political, might actually take place relatively soon. For the simple reason that it's not just the Russians who are experiencing the deprivations being caused by the war, but the Russian elites, the economic elites, and especially the political elites, many of whom must be, and there is actually evidence for this, must be and are fed up with Putin and his transformation of Russia into a huge North Korea. Keep in mind that most Russian elites vacation in the West. They send their kids to Western schools. They travel to the West, or at least they used to travel to the West. And they're still very much Western oriented. So Putin's shift of geopolitical priorities to China and North Korea, while it may be geopolitically reasonable, isn't something that necessarily appeals to most Russians and certainly doesn't appeal to most Russian elites. Thank you for your attention. I see I did take 13 more minutes than I promised I would, but I welcome your questions. I welcome your comments, both critical and uncritical. Is there such a thing as an uncritical comment? But in any case, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Motyl. I must say very uncritically that your analysis is brilliant, and I hope you can field a few questions. Here is the first one from Dr. Leonard Deutsch, our former graduate dean of Marshall University. Please, Len.
Putin has created a colossal amount of damage. What have you heard in terms of a reconstruction plan?
There's talk of it, and there is also a conference, a big conference is planned on reconstruction plans. But, you know, at this point in time, it's all a bit premature because, of course, no one quite knows when the war will end, what condition Ukraine will be in. At this point, the damage that's been done to Ukraine, the estimate that I saw yesterday, I believe, was something like $563 billion. I may be off by a few billion, but it was around that figure. So, you know, Ukraine is in no position to pay that kind of money. So whatever reconstruction takes place will have to rely either on international/Western assistance, which will certainly be forthcoming. Will it be forthcoming in those amounts is really the question. Might depend on Russian reparations, but that again depends on whether Russia loses and has a government willing to fork to provide the cash. And then of course there is the 300 billion in frozen Russian assets that the United States, 10 billion I believe are in the United States, something like 290 billion are in Europe. And the United States has expressed an interest in essentially appropriating the 10 billion and providing it to Ukraine. The Europeans are rather more skittish about this. They argue that it would be economically complicated, it would be financially complicated, might affect the status of the euro. Some argue that it might be technically illegal. If you're interested in that particular issue, by the way, there is a long paper produced by the Harvard legal expert Lawrence Tribe and a number of his colleagues. It appeared sometime towards the end of last year, where he gives this kind of point-by-point analysis, arguing that for any number of legitimate international legal reasons, expropriating those monies would be perfectly acceptable and would be in no violation. But that said, there is talk of reconstructions. The Ukrainians are talking about this. There is the planned conference. But at this point in time, it's all somewhat theoretical more than actually practical.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Motyl. Any more questions, please? Comments, questions from our live viewers and panel, please.
I see we have in
Open
the
your-
chat. We have in the chat a question, or actually a comment from Chuck Somerville. Chuck Somerville is the Dean Emeritus from the College of Science. And he writes, "We have heard in the popular press that Russia is seeking arms and ammunition from China and North Korea and seems likely to get help there. Are any countries likely to provide support to Russia in the form of troops on the ground?"
I can't see that happening. Well, I mean, there was talk of, I believe it was Nepalese mercenaries were supposed to have gotten involved. You know, I'm not so sure that's terribly significant. There was talk in the past, I don't know how reliable this is, that some African mercenaries might be drafted. But in terms of regular armed forces, you know, soldiers in uniforms with training, guns, tanks, and so on, I don't know of any country that's been willing to provide that. North Korea made some noises, but they've essentially been providing Russia with missiles, and a significant number of those missiles apparently misfire, explode before they're actually sent off into the atmosphere. So that's somewhat of a mixed blessing. China, as you certainly know, has been providing Russia with certain technical assistance. There has been no talk, at least not to my knowledge, of providing soldiers boots on the ground. There has been talk of China providing Russia with actual weaponry. That was a statement made by a US, I believe, administration representative. And then within a day or two, that was contradicted by Anthony Blinken. So it's unclear as to whether that's the case. It would be somewhat unusual for China to do this, because, you know, China's own position on the conflict is somewhat wishy-washy. On the one hand, it obviously supports Russia. On the other hand, it's to China's advantage for Russia to be weakened by the war, because that enables China to extort lower prices for oil and gas, and be able to flood the Russian market with its own consumer goods, especially cars. So, you know, in a way, the Chinese are similar to Westerners. They want Russia to be weaker, but they're somewhat fearful of a possible Russian defeat, a major Russian defeat that might entail collapse of one kind or other. But in any case, the short answer to your question is, thus far, it's been, to my knowledge, it's been Russians, and obviously non-Russian minorities from within the Russian Federation. They've taken a very large hit. And if you look at the distribution of casualties, this has been compiled by a variety of Russian sources, they're overwhelmingly from non-Russian regions, which also happen to be the most impoverished regions. And it's not, and the reason people are dying is, well, first of all, they're being sent to the front, but before they can be sent to the front, they have to be cajoled into joining or into not resisting the draft. And the way Russia has been doing that is by promising them fantastic salaries by their standards. You know, if you promise a very, very poor person a lot of money, he or she might be far more inclined to risk their life rather than someone living in Moscow or St. Petersburg who really sees no reason to fall for that kind of trick.
Yeah, our co-host, Dr. Renata Tabasheva, she actually focused one of our sessions on exactly that, the plight of Russian minorities on the front lines. You mentioned, I want to come back to something you mentioned, but I see that one of our guests has his hand up, and so I'm going to yield the microphone to Igor.
Igor Motyl, please. Welcome. Open your microphone. You are muted. Unmute yourself.
It's on the top right.
Igor, you're still muted.
Now, do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. But it's strange because in this system you cannot just click. You have to do three things, complicated things to be unmuted. Okay. Thank you very much for your thought. My question maybe is a little bit aside from the main kind of topic, but still interesting. There is a huge literature about Russia. There is a huge science called, earlier it was called Sovietology. Now I don't know how it is called. Maybe whatever.
Post-Sovietology.
Post-Sovietology or post-Sovietology, whatever it is, right? And on the one hand. On the other hand, there are hundreds or maybe thousands of different people which follow the development in this country, like different state agencies, spies, whatever it is. Why, in your opinion, everything which happened there happened so unexpectedly? So nobody talked about the war seriously, or very few maybe, and nobody knows what to do, and all plans which have been prepared, if they were, are not fulfilled, and our, American administration is not ready at all. If you look at the strategy which this Biden's administration followed during the war, you will see flip-flops 10 times maybe. So they started with accepting the president, and they, oh no, give him the plane to fly out, etc. Then no, we give you this type of weapon, but we do not give this, and then again and again, and now, like today, it looks like they agreed that they give the weapon for the long distance, but only in Kharkov direction, kind of things. It's unbelievable. When you look at this circus, it just it creates impression that nobody knows what's going on. It's extremely reactive, not proactive. It's no strategy in mind, nothing. It's very sad and it's very troubling. Like, is it typical, in your opinion, from any war? Of course, it's extremely uncertain situation, but anyway, kind of lack of clear ideas, lack of clear understanding of what's going on is just amazes everyone. Because if American wanted to do something and had the strategy, they could stop that war in the very beginning in 1914, in fact. They didn't do it. And so it goes on. What's your general estimation of this kind of situation, both from experts' point of view, like what people did in their writings, and in practical, what did administrators, etc.?
Well, you know, again, as you were talking, I kept on thinking of the Soviet Union, the Soviet collapse.
Yeah, the same thing.
Same thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Both government and academics couldn't imagine that it would happen. And the same happens now. Both government and academics couldn't really imagine that Putin would turn into a tyrant, that the war was possible. And I think a lot of it has to do with the assumption made by academics, well, by people in general, the assumption made by people in general that, excuse me, let me just turn my phone off. Okay. The assumption that the way things are today is the way they will be tomorrow. So there's a there's the belief, the assumption of continuity. Continuity tends to rule our thinking about political and economic processes. It's hard for us to imagine some kind of huge disruption. And people who predict disruptions, whether it's revolutions, wars, breakdowns, crises of one kind or other, they're oftentimes dismissed as being cranks. I think that's just a natural kind of policy making assumption, but it's also one that is very much human. We imagine that tomorrow will be like today, and the day after tomorrow will be like yesterday, and so on and so forth. So that's point number one. Point number two is that in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, the West was triumphant. And there was a significant belief, there was a significant, deeply held belief that democracy would triumph. The history was at an end. Poor Mr. Fukuyama is always quoted in this particular regard. That Russia would finally become normal, that all the post-Soviet states would succeed in building democracies, that they were all embarking on transitions and so on and so forth. And that belief has sustained people for a significant period of time. And it's only in recent years that it's begun crumbling. First sign was that the post-Soviet republics were not all becoming democracies. But one could say, well, but it doesn't matter. The important thing is Ukraine. The important thing is Russia. And then, of course, Putin comes to power and he starts embarking on a variety of authoritarian measures. And the response on the part of many people was, well, this is also standard. This is nothing new. The Russians want authoritarian, strong leaders. So this is no deviation from the past. It's just continuation. And that kind of thinking, sort of this baseline belief in continuity in conjunction with this optimism about the future of this particular region, led us to imagine that things would work out. Somehow or other, these things, these terrible things, war, genocide, conflict, would not happen. And if they did, they would be confined to very small places in very short periods of time. And it's only now that there's been a reset going on within the Western mind. And I think Americans suffered highly from this, but there was at least a willingness on the part of many American analysts and policymakers to imagine that something might not quite work out the way it was supposed to. When one looks at European policymakers and analysts, they were completely beholden to this view. And again, the Germans above all else. History had ended, relations with Russia were perfect. Putin was a Democrat, as Gerhard Schröder reminded us. Gas could be imported. This would have no implications for German security, would have no implications for the rest of Europe. And we could just continue living and expanding our good neighborly relations with this Russia that in the meantime was transforming into a monstrous system. People did point that out, but they were largely ignored because they were pointing to things that didn't fit this overall view of Russia, Europe, the West, as being pretty much positive and tending in the right direction in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse and the end of the Cold War. So that would be my answer to my very long answer to your very simple question.
It's not simple. Does it not, this situation, which is which repeats itself many times in history, does it not insert in your mind kind of skepticism about the social sciences, politology, Sovietology, so because why all that is needed if it just spectacularly doesn't work when something really happens?
You're asking a terrific question. There's been work done on this by a philosopher at Columbia University called Philip Kitcher, and he looked at predictions made by political scientists and possibly by Sovietologists, and came up with the conclusion that most of the time they're wrong, and that one would be just as equally well off taking a coin and flipping it,
right,
and making decisions on the basis of flipped coins. Unfortunately, there's something to that. At the same time, as you know, policymakers want advice. They want to be told what to do. Do this or do that. They need this information, and we then provide it. But as I try to emphasize in my talk, even today, and not just today, but at the end of the 1980s, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, and at any point in history, there are always at least two diametrically opposed views of what what's going on and how to respond. So whom do you listen to today? Should Biden listen to me and Russian opposition analysts who argue that Putin is weak and that the collapse of the Russian Federation is probably a good thing? Or should he listen to the other side who thinks that that would be a bad thing and Putin is strong? And the most one can say is, well, I think I'm right. Of course, they think they're right. So the ideological struggle continues. And, one can only pity the poor policymakers who want clear answers to questions. And instead, they get bombarded with a variety of very different analyses.
Okay, yeah.
So my own approach is to say we should be modest. We need to continue doing what we're doing. We need to try to be as open-minded as possible, take into consideration a variety of kinds of evidence, both positive and negative, try to reach conclusions, make genuine conclusions, and make genuine recommendations. We academics have to be bold enough to say that our theories imply certain courses of action. And then if we're right, hooray. And if we're wrong, we need to say we're wrong. We can't simply put all of the burden on poor policymakers who expect us to give them advice. But as I said, we need to be modest. There are things that we can predict with greater degrees of accuracy. There are things like the future of Russia. Good Lord. I'm not sure that even...
Did you hear about many academics who said we are wrong?
Well, you mean about the Soviet Union?
Yeah, particularly.
Not really.
Not really, exactly.
There's always a way out.
Exactly. So this is what, yeah.
And that's
there is,
the
for
problem.
Example, such a person, Mirschmeyer, believe.
Oh, yes.
He talks about horrible things with very high confidence, etc. And somebody hears, listens what he talks. Okay, thank you very much.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Dr. Motyl. This is a wonderful discussion. Do we have maybe a couple of more questions or comments from our regular viewers and panel members, please? I want to thank Dr. Motyl for his insights tremendously. It's fascinating to see this as history literally unravels. Katerina?
I'm wondering if you think that the October 7th attack on Israel from Gaza, if there was the timing of it, you mentioned when you first started speaking about how there's different reasons why attention has shifted from Ukraine, from Russia's war in Ukraine, and of course the conflict in Israel was part of that. I've heard it just kind of speculated by non-experts that it wasn't just bad, it wasn't coincidental, it wasn't the timing, it was that either Putin had somehow had some hand in causing that attack to happen to distract the world's attention from the terrible things happening in Ukraine. Your thoughts on that?
If there had never or rarely been armed conflict between Hamas and more generally the Palestinians and Israel, or if conditions had been peaceful for decades, and then suddenly out of the blue, this kind of crisis takes place, I'd say, well, you never know, right? Putin and the FSB, maybe they're up to their old tricks. But essentially, Hamas and Israel have been in a state of war for the last, 20 or so years, with periodic attacks on both sides. So the surprising thing about the October 7th attack was the extent, the size, and the degree to which atrocities were committed. The fact that Hamas attacked is nothing new because they've been doing this for the last 20 years. So I'm inclined to think that Putin's role in this was at best very, very marginal. We do know that the Russians apparently, they maintain relations with Hamas. They may have coordinated certain things. They appear to have provided Hamas with certain weapons. There is evidence to that effect. But as I said, if it weren't Hamas, and the fact that Hamas has been involved in a bloody conflict with Israel for so long a time, if this were some utterly new organization that had never fought against Israel, well, then one might be inclined to say there's a Russian trace in this. But as is, I'm skeptical. But you never know. There's lots of talk now amongst these Russian opposition circles, the analysts, that Putin is planning some kind of diversion, possibly a hybrid war in the Baltic states and affecting Finland. So as you probably know, I mean, the Russians have claimed that the sea boundary between them, Finland, and Estonia is incorrect. They removed some buoys. They've been making a variety of other noises. And part of that would be to punish the Finns and punish the Estonians, challenge NATO in a relatively cost-free manner. But of course, at the same time, if they were to cause some serious trouble within Estonia, imagine, for the sake of argument, again, a scenario that's been, it's not unique to me. Imagine the Russian FSB explodes some bombs in Narva, and 20 or 30 Russian speakers or Russians are killed. And the immediate aftermath, the FSB publishes a statement by the Estonian Fascist Front saying that they are now starting a war against Russians. And then the poor Russians beg Russia to come and provide them with assistance. I mean, this is nothing new. And this has been done many times in the past. How would NATO respond? Right, it's unclear. How would Russia respond? That's also unclear, but it would obviously cause difficulties for NATO. It would obviously cause enormous difficulties for Estonia, and it would succeed in diverting attention from Ukraine to another part of Europe. So that's not inconceivable.
Well, thank you. I see that Leslie Titus has his hand up. Leslie is a good friend of our program, one of our regular viewers. Leslie, the microphone is yours.
Hello. So I suppose my question kind of builds off of our discussion, well, your discussion earlier of the Biden administration giving, and obviously various European countries giving permission for Ukrainians to use weapons against Russian targets, at least in the Kharkiv area. What would you say that that decision was mainly a tactical decision, or what do you think is the political calculus for making that decision and also for making it public?
Well, the reason I think is there's just been an enormous amount of moral pressure as well as political pressure that's been placed on the Biden administration to permit that. Just look at any number of, Google sources, you'll find that there are scores of articles in Europe, in the United States, by all manner of news outlets, analysts, policymakers, former ambassadors, arguing that it's high time that the United States permitted such a move. Then there's the fact that 11 European countries have already agreed to that and have said that, Ukraine is more than welcome to utilize their weapons in any part of Russia that it chooses to do. And then last but not least, there are the legal arguments. I mentioned Lawrence Tribe of Harvard, but there are other people in that particular discipline who've been saying this is perfectly legal according to international law. It wouldn't be a violation. The fact that the General Assembly condemned the Russian aggression 2 years ago and defined it as an aggression gives Ukraine the right to defend itself and gives any other country in the world the right to defend Ukraine. So all the bases are covered, all right? And at the same time, so you've got moral pressure, political pressure. The Ukrainian diaspora has been pressuring Biden. I'm not sure how terribly important that is, but it's, you know, marginally of some influence as well. And then last but not least, there's the carnage on the front. As you know, there have been lots of reports regarding the condition of Ukrainian cities and of Ukrainian soldiers, the fact that they're being bombarded on a daily basis. Kharkiv seems to be the target of ultimate destruction on the part of the Russians. And a lot of this has to do with the fact, most of it perhaps has to do with the fact that Ukraine can't fire back. They can fire on Russian troops in Ukraine, but they can fire on the artillery systems, on the air bases, and the agglomerations of Russian troops just on the other side of their border with Russia, because that's already using weapons in Russia. And the case has been made that this is, you know, this is absurd. You're essentially telling the Ukrainians that they should box you know, Cassius Muhammad Ali with one hand tied behind their back. It just doesn't work, right? It's simply impossible. So that's, again, the kind of a rational military argument. So you put this all together, and I think that the pressure on the Biden administration just got to the point where they said, okay, you can use our weapons, but on condition that they're only used, you know, roughly across the border. Now, how much across the border is the question. I haven't seen a specific number, but again, maybe I just haven't looked close enough. But it, you know, is it 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, right? And if it's 20 miles, what happens if you shoot something that's 20 miles and 5 yards? Are you violating the deal, or are you still within the permitted range? Anyway, all of this opens up all sorts of very interesting configurations, because if all the countries that have thus far supported Ukraine give Ukraine the green light, then that begins to change conditions on the battlefront dramatically, not just on the Kharkiv front, but it would enable Ukraine to strike targets, even more so than it's already doing, within Russia proper. And that could be very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Motyl. Thank you very much. As we are here for more than an hour now, we will need to conclude our session and say great thanks to our speaker and wonderful comments that have been made. I have another notion here in chat from Dr. Somerville. He says that he heard presentation of mathematical proof that diverse groups will always make better decisions, meaning those that don't just include experts on specific subject. Your comment reminded me of this proof. Unfortunately, that has been years. I don't remember the name of the presenter. It says, well, sure, diverse groups will for a mix of experts and lay people.
Yeah, Dean Somerville is
guess.
responding to a comment from Leslie. There's an exchange, but here he is in person. Dean Somerville, you are welcome to join the conversation.
Yes, please.
Oh, thanks, Katerina. Thanks, Victor. I was just responding to a comment from Leslie. No, not a comment for Dr. Motyl, but thanks. I much appreciated and enjoyed your talk very much. Thank you.
Well, you know, there's just in terms of what you were talking about, diverse groups making better decisions. The classical historian Victor Davis Hanson has argued in a number of his books on warfare that countries that have some degree of autonomy for the individual citizenship, which entails discussion, disagreement, and so on. And he always refers to the ancient Greeks, but also to the Romans, are better able to make correct decisions than Persian dynasts who have the final and ultimate word on every single thing. Again, I'm not a classical historian, so I'm not in any position to say that he's right or wrong, but it's a compelling argument. And one of the things that strikes me, again, I happen to be reading Xenophon's Anabasis at the very moment. And as you know, it's about the withdrawal of 10,000 Greek soldiers from Persia back to the homeland. And almost the entire book concerns, it depicts their debates on where to go, what to do, whom to fight, whether to retreat, whether that enabled them eventually to survive as they did, or whether that was just pure luck. Again, I don't know, but it's certainly evidence that would seem to support Mr. Hansen and Dean Somerville as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Motyl. We'll conclude our session now and let you go. And thank you again for honoring us with your expertise. And I will ask Dr. Shrey to say our greetings to Ukrainian viewers, which I also see on the panel now.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
This concludes our 118th weekly session of Ukraine podcast. Slava Ukraine.
Героям
Heroyam
слава.
Slava. Thank you very much.